Imagine you're a people who've known only trees, dense forests where you can barely see 100 paces ahead, where the world is vertical, bounded by bark and leaves, where deer trails wind through shadows, and your entire universe exists beneath a canopy. And then one day, you climb a ridge, and suddenly there's nothing. No trees, no boundaries, just grass, rolling away forever, and on that grass, animals beyond counting. That's the moment that changed everything for the Lakota people. That's the moment when forest dwellers became lords of the plains, and it happened faster than you might think. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Around 1700, the Lakota weren't the fearsome horseback warriors of legend. They were woodland people living near the Great Lakes, in what's now Minnesota, doing what their ancestors had done for generations. Hunting deer, harvesting wild rice, living in permanent villages near water. But they had a problem. Actually, they had the Ojibwe. Armed with French muskets from traders to the east, the Ojibwe were pushing westward, and the Lakota found themselves on the wrong end of that expansion. You can fight, you can stay and die slowly, or you can move. The Lakota chose to move. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just a retreat. Some Lakota scouts had already been venturing west of the Missouri River onto the edge of the Great Plains, and they'd seen something that changed the calculation entirely. Buffalo. Not just a few buffalo, not herds like we might imagine today in a nature documentary. We're talking about biological phenomenon that defies easy description. The first Lakota warriors who crested those bluffs above the Missouri saw the prairie as a living thing. The earth itself seemed to move. Brown and black as far as vision carried, the herd stretched from horizon to horizon, and the sound, imagine the sound of hundreds of thousands of hooves, the grunting and bellowing carrying for miles. One French trader's account from this period describes riding for 3 days through a single buffalo herd without ever finding its edge. 3 days. These weren't animals occupying a landscape, they were the landscape. And the Lakota, being forced from their forest homes, looked at this and saw opportunity, not just survival, empire. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened fast by historical standards. Within 2 generations, these woodland people had mastered an entirely different way of life. They had to learn everything from scratch. How do you hunt animals that massive? How do you preserve that much meat in the summer heat? How do you move an entire community to follow the herds? Every single aspect of daily life had to be reimagined. But they had help. And this is where we need to talk about the white buffalo calf woman, because whether you approach this as literal truth or as the mythological encoding of a cultural revolution, her story is central to understanding what happened next. According to Lakota tradition, she appeared during this transitional period, bringing the sacred pipe and teaching the people how to live in balance with the buffalo. She gave them 7 sacred ceremonies, established the spiritual framework for their new life. When she left, she promised to return someday, and she transformed into a white buffalo calf as she departed. Now, you can debate the literal details, but here's what's not debatable. The Lakota developed one of the most sophisticated hunting cultures in human history, and they did it remarkably quickly. They created a complete system of knowledge about buffalo behavior, about the seasons and the grass and the water. They learned which bulls were solitary and dangerous, which cows led the herds, how to read the signs of where the animals would be, next week or next month. This wasn't casual knowledge. This was science encoded in stories and songs and ceremony. And then came the horses, Spanish horses escaping from settlements in the south, bred and traded north through native networks. The Lakota got their first horses around 1720, and they took to horseback culture like they'd been born to it. Within 30 years, they weren't just using horses. They were among the finest cavalry fighters on the continent. A Lakota warrior on horseback with a buffalo hunt in progress. This was precision teamwork that would impress any military tactician. Riders communicating through hand signals at full gallop, driving buffalo toward cliffs or corrals, bringing down animals with arrows or lances while their horses dodged and pivoted through the stampeding herd. But here's what really set the Lakota apart. They understood this wasn't just about hunting. It was about territory, about control. The Great Plains weren't empty. The Crow held prime hunting grounds near the Bighorn Mountains. The Pawnee controlled areas of modern Nebraska. The Arikara, the Kiowa, various Algonquian peoples, they all had claims to different sections of the Buffalo Range. The Lakota looked at the map and saw the richest territories, and they took them. Through warfare, through alliance, through sheer determined expansion, they carved out an empire. By 1750, just 50 years after leaving the forests, the Lakota controlled some of the best buffalo country in the world. The Black Hills, sacred and strategic, the Powder River country, where the hunting was exceptional. They'd pushed the Crow west, absorbed some smaller groups into their alliance, and established themselves as the dominant power across a huge swath of the northern plains. Chiefs like Standing Bull, whose name you probably don't know but whose descendants would include some of the most famous leaders in Native American history, they built the foundation of Lakota greatness during this period. The Lakota also understood trade. Those buffalo hides they were taking, they weren't all for their own use. They established trading relationships that stretched from the Pacific coast, where they could get shells and coastal goods, all the way to the Great Lakes, where their old enemies, the Ojibwe, were now sometimes their trading partners. Buffalo robes went east, guns and iron goods came west. It was a continental economy, and the Lakota were major players. But most importantly, they built a culture. A complete way of life centered on the buffalo, and I mean centered in a way that's hard for us to grasp today. The buffalo wasn't just food, it was housing, clothing, tools, fuel, glue, thread, rope, containers, ceremonial objects, the basis of their spirituality. The entire social structure, from warrior societies to family relationships to the role of women in processing the hides, everything revolved around the buffalo. They didn't just hunt buffalo, they became buffalo people. So, by the time we get to 1770, 1780, the Lakota have completed one of the most remarkable transformations in human history. In less than a century, they've gone from forest villagers to masters of the plains, commanding territory larger than many European nations, living in balance with herds of buffalo that seemed as endless as the grass itself. They've become what we picture when we think of Plains Indians, those iconic warriors on horseback, feathered headdresses streaming in the wind, hunting buffalo across an infinite horizon. They were at the beginning of their golden age. They didn't know they had maybe 70 years left before their entire world would end. Before those endless herds would vanish so completely that their grandchildren would know buffalo only from stories. Before valleys that once shook with millions of hooves would fall silent except for the wind whistling through mountains of kauf, sun-bleached bones. But in 1780, none of that horror had happened yet. The buffalo were still everywhere. The Lakota were still rising, and if you'd told them then that the herds could disappear, that the thunder of hooves could ever stop echoing across the prairie, they would have thought you were describing the end of the world itself. They would have been right. Let's talk about what it actually meant to be a buffalo person. Not the romantic version, not the simplified story, but the real, intricate, sophisticated reality of Lakota life at its peak. We're talking about the period from roughly 1750 to 1860, over a century, when 40,000 Lakota people controlled territory that supported somewhere around 20 million buffalo. 20 million. Try to picture that number. You can't, really. Nobody can. But let's try anyway. A Lakota camp in, say, 1840. Picture it. 50, maybe 80 tipis arranged in a circle, the opening always facing east to greet the sun. Each teepee required between 12 and 20 buffalo hides, scraped and tanned and sewn together by women who'd learned the craft from their mothers, who learned it from theirs. The work was staggering. A single hide took days to properly prepare. You had to stake it out, scrape away every bit of flesh and fat, work the skin with a mixture of buffalo brains and liver, essentially the original biochemistry, breaking down the proteins to make the leather soft and waterproof, then smoking it to preserve it and give it that distinctive color and smell. And that was just housing. A family needed robes for sleeping, 15 to 20 buffalo hides thick enough to keep you warm when it's 30 below zero on the plains. They needed parfleches, those rawhide containers painted with geometric designs, for storing everything from dried meat to ceremonial objects. They needed clothes. A woman's dress took 3 hides, a man's war shirt another 2. Winter moccasins, leggings, caps lined with fur for the brutal cold, children's clothes that would be replaced as they grew. Add it all up, and a single family probably used upward of 40 to 50 buffalo per year, times 40,000 people. But here's what's remarkable. Despite that level of use, the herds were fine, actually thriving. Because the Lakota understood something we're only now relearning, sustainable harvest isn't about taking less, it's about taking correctly. They hunted bulls more than cows, leaving the breeding females to reproduce. They never took calves unless absolutely necessary. They moved with the seasons, never overhunting any one area. They had complex social rules about when and where to hunt, enforced by warrior societies who had the authority to punish anyone who jumped the gun and spooked the herd before the communal hunt. Those communal hunts were something to see. The whole camp would participate. Scouts would locate a herd, then runners would bring word back. The camp's hunt chief, usually an experienced warrior who'd proven his knowledge and judgment over years, would coordinate everything. Warrior societies like the Kit Fox, the Strong Hearts, the Crow Owners, they'd enforce discipline. Nobody moved until the signal. If someone broke the rules, if they charged early and scattered the herd, they could have their teepee cut to pieces, their weapons broken. The community's survival depended on order. When the hunt began, it was controlled chaos. Dozens of mounted warriors surrounding a part of the herd, arrows flying, horses wheeling and turning through the stampede. A good hunter could shoot arrow after arrow without ever touching his bow with his hands, holding it with his legs, guiding his horse with just pressure and voice. They'd mark their arrows so everyone knew which kills were theirs, because that mattered for distribution and honor. But the meat? That was shared. Widows got shares. Elders got shares. The successful hunters took pride in providing for those who couldn't hunt. And then the real work began. The butchering. Within hours of a kill, women and young people would be at the site, taking apart animals that weighed half a ton or more. Every part had a purpose. Every single part. The hides we've talked about. The meat, obviously. Tongue was a delicacy. Hump meat, the rich fatty muscle from the shoulders, was prized. But also the organs. The stomach lining became water containers. The bladder, same thing. The intestines, cleaned and turned inside out, became sausage casings. The hooves were boiled down for glue. The horns became cups, ladles, spoons, ceremonial objects. The bones. Oh, the bones had 100 uses. Tools, scrapers, needles, sled runners, war clubs. The sinew, that tough connective tissue, became thread so strong and fine that women could sew with it more precisely than with anything Europeans brought to trade. Even the buffalo chips, the dried dung, that was fuel. On the treeless plains, those chips burned hot and clean, perfect for cooking. A Lakota woman could gauge the temperature of her fire by the color of the smoke from buffalo chips, adjust her cooking with precision. The brain was saved for tanning, like we mentioned, but also there was a spiritual element. The Lakota believed that each buffalo had exactly enough brain matter to tan its own hide. One buffalo, one hide's worth of tanning solution, nature providing the exact tool needed for the job. Whether that's literally true or not, it's beautiful thinking, and it reflects a worldview where nothing is wasted, nothing is separate, everything fits together. Let's talk about a specific family. Red Cloud's grandfather, a man whose name has been lost to history, but who lived during this golden age. He was a warrior in the Strong Heart Society, respected for his courage and his hunting skill. His wife was renowned for her quill work, decorating parfleches and moccasins with dyed porcupine quills in intricate geometric patterns that told stories, marked achievements, carried meanings that other Lakota could read like text. They had 5 children who survived to adulthood, which was better than average. They lived their entire lives within the buffalo culture, never imagining any other way of existing. This grandfather participated in the sun dance every summer, the great ceremony that renewed the bond between the people and the buffalo, between earth and sky, between human and sacred. Men would fast for days, pierce their chest muscles with wooden skewers attached to rawhide thongs, dance while staring at the sun until the flesh tore free or they collapsed in vision. It sounds brutal to us. It was brutal. But it was also voluntary, a sacrifice offered to ensure the buffalo would return, the people would thrive. The scars were marks of honor, proof of dedication to the community's survival. The winter counts, the historical records painted on buffalo hide, they marked the years by memorable events. The winter the stars fell, 1833, when the Leonid meteor shower terrified and amazed everyone who saw it. The winter so many died from spotted sickness, smallpox epidemics that killed thousands. The winter of the big horse-stealing raid against the Crow. Each year, one image, one symbol, and the keeper of the winter count could recite the entire history, dozens or hundreds of years of stories encoded in pictures on buffalo hide. By 1840, Lakota power seemed unshakable. They'd defeated or made peace with most of their native rivals. They had thousands of horses, symbols of wealth and military power. They controlled the richest buffalo grounds. The warrior societies were strong, the families were thriving, the ceremonies were unbroken. Young men grew up hearing stories of their fathers' and grandfathers' victories, learning to ride before they could properly walk, training with bows until they could hit a target from horseback at full gallop. The women's societies were equally important, though less talked about in history books. They organized the camp moves, preserved and distributed food, maintained the elaborate systems of kinship and obligation that held society together. A woman like Pretty Shield, who lived through this era and later told her story, she could set up a full tipi in 15 minutes, break it down in 10. She knew which plants could be eaten when, which had medicinal properties, how to doctor injuries and illnesses with herbs and roots and buffalo parts. She knew the songs, the stories, the proper ways to do everything from naming a baby to honoring the dead. This wasn't primitive life. This was complex, sophisticated civilization perfectly adapted to its environment. The Lakota of 1840 had achieved something remarkable. They'd built a sustainable culture that supported tens of thousands of people in comfort, even prosperity, on land that white settlers would later struggle to farm. They'd done it without depleting the resource base, without destroying the ecosystem, while maintaining rich spiritual and artistic traditions. They held councils with other tribes at Bear Butte, that sacred mountain rising from the plains in what's now South Dakota, a place holy to many peoples. They traded at great gatherings, hundreds of lodges coming together, thousands of people exchanging goods and stories and marriages that created bonds between bands and tribes. It was a functioning economy, a working political system, a living culture at its absolute peak. And here's the thing that makes what comes next so devastating. This wasn't a dying culture that collapsed from internal problems. This wasn't a civilization that had exhausted its resources or fallen into civil war. The Lakota in 1860 were strong, vibrant, successful. The buffalo herds, despite centuries of hunting, were still vast beyond imagining. The grass still grew, the water still flowed. Everything worked. They had no way of knowing that within a single generation, within 25 years, the buffalo would be gone. Not reduced, not depleted, gone. They had no way of knowing that men with rifles would come, men who killed not for food or hides or survival, but for tongues alone, for sport, for the explicit purpose of destroying the herds to destroy the people who depended on them. In 1860, if you'd told a Lakota warrior that soon he'd watch the last buffalo disappear, that his children would grow up knowing the animals only from stories, that the thundering herds would be replaced by silence and bones, he wouldn't have believed you, couldn't have believed you. It would be like telling someone today that all the fish will vanish from the oceans next year, or all the birds will fall from the sky next month. Impossible. Unthinkable. But it happened. And it happened so fast that people who remembered the height of buffalo culture lived long enough to see the absolute end of it. One lifetime. One terrible, brutal, swift lifetime. And that story, that catastrophe, that's where we're going next. 1865. The American Civil War has just ended, and the United States is about to turn its full attention westward. The Transcontinental Railroad is coming, settlers are coming, the army is coming, and they're about to wage a war unlike anything the Lakota have faced before. Not a war against warriors, a war against the buffalo themselves. But let's start with what it actually looked like, because the scale is almost impossible to process. William Frederick Cody, Buffalo Bill, not yet the showman of legend but a meat hunter supplying railroad crews. In 18 months, from 1867 to 1868, he personally killed 4,280 buffalo. One man, 18 months, 4,000 animals. He was good at it, sure, but he wasn't unique. There were thousands of hide hunters spreading across the plains, and they had something that Lakota never had, repeating rifles that could fire dozens of rounds without reloading, and a market that paid cash money for buffalo hides. The eastern factories wanted leather. Buffalo hide made excellent industrial belting, the thick leather straps that drove machinery in the mills and factories powering America's Industrial Revolution. Fashion wanted buffalo robes, luxurious and warm, so the price was good, and the hunters came. They developed a system, a ruthlessly efficient system. Find a herd, set up downwind with a heavy rifle, a Sharps usually, 50 caliber, and start shooting. The trick was to drop the lead animal, the matriarch cow the others followed. Do it quietly, at distance, and the herd would mill around confused instead of stampeding. A good hunter could kill 50, 60, even 100 buffalo without the herd even running. Just keep shooting until your barrel overheated or your ammunition ran low. Then came the skinners. They'd arrive with wagons, peel the hides off, and leave everything else. All that meat, thousands of pounds per animal, left to rot. The hump, the tongue, maybe they'd take those if they were in the mood. Everything else? Wasted. Coyotes and wolves would feast for a few days, then the carcasses would bloat in the sun and collapse, and eventually just be bones bleaching white under the endless sky. The Lakota started finding the evidence in the late 1860s. Hunting parties would ride to traditional grounds and find, instead of buffalo, their remains. One account from 1873 describes warriors entering a valley they'd hunted in for generations, expecting to find the spring herds. Instead, they found bones. Mountains of bones. Skulls stacked like cordwood. Rib cages scattered across the prairie for miles. The smell must have been overwhelming at first, death on an industrial scale. And the silence, no birds, the scavengers having moved on. No insects, nothing left to eat. Just white bones and the wind. Try to imagine being one of those warriors. Your grandfather hunted here, your father hunted here. You hunted here as a boy with your uncles, learned to read the buffalo trails, learned where they'd be when the grass greened up. You're riding in with your son, ready to teach him the same lessons. And instead, you find apocalypse. You find the physical evidence that your entire way of life is being erased, deliberately, systematically, efficiently. Because it was deliberate. This wasn't accidental overhunting. General Philip Sheridan, Civil War hero, now commanding U.S. forces on the plains, he said it explicitly. In 1875, speaking to the Texas legislature about hide hunters, he argued against protecting the buffalo. His words, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated, as it is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." He understood perfectly. Destroy the buffalo, destroy the Indians. No buffalo, no teepee covers, no robes for winter, no meat, no reason to resist the reservations. It was economic warfare, ecological warfare, and it worked. The railroad companies helped, running special excursion trains where passengers could shoot buffalo from the windows for sport. They'd advertise it, buffalo hunting trips. You'd ride west in comfort, and when the train slowed near a herd, you'd open the window and blast away with whatever gun you'd brought. The railroad got to clear animals off the tracks and advertise an exciting adventure. The passengers got trophies and stories. The buffalo got slaughtered by the thousands for no purpose beyond entertainment. The bones themselves became an industry. Once the hide hunters had taken the valuable leather and moved on, other entrepreneurs moved in to collect the bones. They'd pile them, these massive mounds, 20 feet high and 100 feet long, beside railroad sidings. The bones went east to be ground into fertilizer, or processed into bone china or refined into bone char for sugar purification. There are photographs, you can see them in archives, showing men standing beside bone piles larger than houses, tons upon tons of bones, all that remained of the great herds. By 1870, the southern herd, the vast population that ranged from Texas up through Kansas, was effectively gone. Millions of buffalo reduced to scattered remnants in less than a decade. The Lakota could see it happening, could see the railroad bringing more hunters, more guns, more death. And they fought back. Red Cloud's war in the 1860s had won concessions, forced the U.S. to abandon forts along the Bozeman Trail. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 promised the Lakota the Black Hills forever, or at least that's what the Lakota thought they were promised. But when gold was discovered in the Black Hills in 1874, well, treaties became suggestions, and white miners flooded in. The army that was supposed to keep whites out ended up protecting the miners from Lakota warriors defending their sacred land. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, the great leaders of resistance, they saw what was coming. Not just loss of land, but extinction of the entire way of life. The Little Bighorn in 1876, Custer's defeat, that was the high point of armed resistance. The Lakota and Cheyenne together, catching the 7th Cavalry overextended and overconfident, wiping out 5 companies in a few hours of desperate fighting. It was a tactical masterpiece and a strategic disaster. The American public was outraged, and the Army's response was overwhelming force. More troops, better supplied, pursuing Lakota bands relentlessly through that winter, but the real weapon wasn't the Army. It was the missing buffalo. By 1880, the northern herd, the Lakota's primary resource, was collapsing. Hunting parties that once found buffalo everywhere now rode for weeks finding nothing but bones. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was the worst. It's remembered in Lakota oral history as the winter when the buffalo didn't come. Families starved. Children cried with hunger that couldn't be satisfied. The old people, who remembered when the herds seemed infinite, they watched their grandchildren suffer and had no answer except stories about the past. Sitting Bull had fled to Canada with his band after Little Bighorn, but even there, north of the Medicine Line, the buffalo were disappearing. He held out until 1881, then surrendered, and came back to face reservation life. Crazy Horse had surrendered earlier, in 1877, and was killed a few months later at Fort Robinson, under circumstances that remain controversial but resulted in a bayonet through his back. The greatest warrior of his generation, dead at 36, his people starving, his world ending. The ghost dance emerged in 1889, spreading from a Paiute prophet named Wovoka through desperate native communities across the West. The message was hope. Dance the ghost dance, wear the special shirts, and the white men will disappear, the buffalo will return, the dead will come back to life, the old world will be restored. For people living in poverty and despair on reservations, receiving irregular rations of government beef that barely kept them alive, this wasn't just religious revival. This was everything they needed to hear. Of course they danced. What else was there? The authorities saw the ghost dance as rebellion, as preparation for war. At Pine Ridge and other Sioux agencies, tensions escalated through the winter of 1890. Sitting Bull was killed during his arrest on December 15, 1890, shot by Indian police in a confused confrontation at his cabin. His followers fled, some joining with Bigfoot's band of Miniconjou Lakota, who were heading toward Pine Ridge, looking for safety, looking for peace. The 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, spoiling for revenge 14 years later. On December 29, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek, the cavalry attempted to disarm Bigfoot's band. Someone's gun went off, nobody knows whose, and the soldiers opened fire. They had rapid-fire Hotchkiss guns positioned on the hills. They poured rounds into the camp where families huddled. Men, women, children, they cut them down without discrimination. Bigfoot, dying of pneumonia, was shot where he lay on a travois. His body froze in the Dakota winter, captured in a photograph that haunts American history. A dead chief, frozen in death, while around him the snow covered the bodies of his people. Estimates range from 150 to 300 killed, most of them unarmed. Some tried to run and were hunted down miles from the camp. A few soldiers died, mostly from their own crossfire in the chaos. When it was over, when the snow finally stopped and the burial parties came, they dug a mass grave and threw the frozen bodies in together. The soldiers who participated received medals of honor, 20 of them, the highest military decoration in the United States, given for a massacre. That was the end. Not just of the ghost dance, but of armed resistance, of any hope for the old life returning. The buffalo were gone. Between 1880 and 1890, the northern herd went from hundreds of thousands to fewer than 1,000 total animals left alive anywhere. A few hundred in Yellowstone, protected accidentally by the creation of the national park, scattered private herds. That was it. From 20 million to under 1,000 in one human lifetime. Lakota elders in 1890 could remember clearly the endless herds of their youth. Men and women in their 50s and 60s had grown up in the Golden Age, had participated in the communal hunts, had lived entirely within buffalo culture, and now they watched their grandchildren grow up on commodities of government beef, living in log cabins on land divided into individual allotments, being sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking Lakota and taught to forget everything their grandparents knew. The silence on the plains was total. No thunder of hooves, no bellowing of bulls, just wind and grass and bones. Millions of bones. So many bones they'd still be finding them decades later, still collecting them and grinding them up for phosphate. The prairie had been emptied, systematically and intentionally, and the people who'd lived in balance with it for over a century were confined to reservations representing tiny fractions of their former territory, dependent on government handouts, watched by agents and soldiers, forbidden to practice their ceremonies, forced to watch their children be taken away to distant schools. If that's not genocide, then what is? The deliberate destruction of the economic basis of a people's existence, the intentional starvation campaign, the massacre of families trying to escape, the cultural erasure enforced by law and violence. That's what happened. That's what the United States did. That's what those bones scattered across the prairie represented. And yet, and this is important, the Lakota didn't disappear. The buffalo came within a whisper of extinction, but they didn't quite go extinct. The culture was nearly destroyed, but not completely. And in the century that followed, in ways both large and small, the work of healing began. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we have to sit with the devastation. We have to understand what was lost before we can appreciate what's been recovered. Because the story doesn't end at Wounded Knee, but it stops there. It has to. That's the bottom of the abyss. Everything that comes next is climbing back up. The years after Wounded Knee were dark. Let's not pretend otherwise. Reservation life in the early 1900s meant poverty, disease, cultural suppression enforced by law. The buffalo were gone, reduced to a few hundred animals scattered in protected parks and private ranches. Lakota children were forcibly removed to boarding schools like Carlisle, where the motto was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." They cut the children's hair, burned their traditional clothes, beat them for speaking their language. They were trying to erase an entire people's identity, turn them into imitation white Americans. But here's what they didn't count on: the strength of memory, the power of stories passed down, the determination of elders who remembered. In those dark decades, when practicing traditional ceremonies could get you arrested, when speaking Lakota at school meant punishment, there were people who kept the knowledge alive. Grandmothers who taught songs in whispers, grandfathers who told the old stories when the authorities weren't watching, medicine men who maintained the ceremonies in secret, waiting for a time when they could practice openly again. The buffalo, meanwhile, were clinging to survival by the thinnest margin. In 1900, there were maybe 300 wild buffalo left in Yellowstone, and perhaps another 500 in private herds and scattered survivors elsewhere. 800 animals from a population that once numbered in the tens of millions. They'd come so close to extinction that one bad winter, one disease outbreak, could have finished them. But something unexpected happened. Some of those private ranchers who'd kept small buffalo herds, they weren't doing it for profit. They genuinely cared about preserving the species. Samuel Walking Coyote, a Salish Indian in Montana, maintained a small herd through the worst years. Charles Goodnight in Texas, James Scotty Phillip in South Dakota, Michel Pablo on the Flathead Reservation. These men, some native, some white, they kept buffalo alive when market forces and government policy wanted them dead. And slowly, carefully, the herds began to recover. The American Bison Society, founded in 1905 by people who recognized what had been lost, worked to establish protected herds in national parks and reserves. By 1930, there were several thousand buffalo alive. Not many, not remotely close to the historical millions, but enough that extinction was no longer inevitable. The species would survive. The question was whether the relationship between the Lakota and the buffalo would survive. For most of the 20th century, that relationship existed mainly in memory and ceremony. Lakota people ate beef, wore manufactured clothes, lived in frame houses. Some moved to cities, looking for work and opportunity. The reservations remained poor, among the poorest places in America. Alcoholism, suicide, disease rates far above the national average. The intergenerational trauma from boarding schools, from the destruction of traditional ways, from centuries of broken promises and active oppression, that trauma rippled through communities, damaging families and lives. But the culture didn't die. Despite everything, it didn't die. The Sundance was practiced again, openly, after decades of prohibition. The Lakota language, though endangered, was still spoken by elders and taught to children by those who refused to let it disappear. The stories about buffalo, about the old ways, about heroes like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, those stories were still told. The connection was strained, attenuated, but not broken. The 1970s brought a new era of native activism and cultural revival. The American Indian movement brought attention to reservation conditions and treaty rights. There was renewed pride in native identity, renewed determination to preserve and revitalize traditional ways. And part of that revival, increasingly, focused on buffalo. Some tribes began acquiring small buffalo herds, working to bring the animals back to tribal lands. It started slowly, a few animals here, a dozen there. But it was deeply symbolic. Buffalo on tribal land again. Not millions, not yet, but a beginning. The Intertribal Buffalo Council, founded in 1992, coordinated efforts across tribes, helping to build up herds, sharing knowledge about buffalo management, working to restore not just the animals but the cultural relationship. And then something happened that seemed almost miraculous to those who believed in the old prophecies. In 1994, on a farm in Wisconsin, a white buffalo calf was born, not albino, but truly white, which is extraordinarily rare. The Lakota prophecy said that the white buffalo calf woman would return in the form of a white buffalo when it was time for healing to begin, for the sacred hoop to be mended. Thousands of native people made pilgrimages to see the calf. Whether you interpret it as literal prophecy fulfilled or as powerful symbolism, it energized the buffalo restoration movement. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, several reservations had substantial herds. The Intertribal Buffalo Council represented over 50 tribes managing more than 15,000 buffalo collectively. These weren't just animals. They were living connections to the past, to traditional ways, to identity and pride. Reservation schools started teaching about buffalo culture again, not as dead history but as living tradition. Elders who remembered the stories from their grandparents worked with younger people to rebuild the knowledge. At Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where Wounded Knee had marked the nadir of Lakota fortunes, buffalo returned to the land. The first releases in the early 2000s were emotional ceremonies. Elders sang songs that hadn't been performed in decades, songs their grandparents had taught them about welcoming the buffalo home. Young people saw living buffalo on Lakota land for the first time in their lives. People cried, overcome by the symbolism, the justice, the return of something sacred that had been stolen. The buffalo programs had practical benefits too. Buffalo meat, much healthier than commodity beef, provided better nutrition. Managing the herds created jobs. Some tribes started buffalo-based economic enterprises, selling meat or breeding stock. The animals themselves helped restore prairie ecosystems, their grazing patterns different from cattle, more natural, better for the native grasses. It was ecological restoration and cultural restoration happening simultaneously. But let's be honest about the scale. Today, there are maybe 400,000 buffalo in North America. That sounds impressive compared to the near extinction of 1900. But remember, there used to be 30 to 60 million, and most of those 400,000 are in private herds, managed as livestock, many genetically mixed with cattle from decades ago when ranchers crossbred them. The truly wild, genetically pure buffalo number in the tens of thousands at most. Tribal herds, all combined, maybe account for 20,000 animals. So yes, there's been recovery. Real, meaningful recovery that deserves celebration. But we're not even close to restoring what was lost. The scale of the historical herds is probably impossible to restore. There's not enough open land. There are towns and farms and fences where buffalo once roamed freely. The ecosystem has been fundamentally altered. The best we can realistically hope for is to maintain genetically healthy populations, to keep the cultural knowledge alive, to give Lakota young people some connection to the animals that defined their ancestors' lives. And that's happening. There are Lakota young people today learning to tan buffalo hides using traditional methods, learning the songs and ceremonies, participating in buffalo releases and herd management, growing up with at least some exposure to buffalo culture, even if it's a pale shadow of what their ancestors knew. The language. Revitalization efforts continue. Immersion schools, teaching children Lakota from a young age, elders recording stories and songs before that knowledge is lost forever. The work is ongoing, and it's hard. Reservation poverty remains crushing for many families. The suicide rate among Lakota young people is heartbreakingly high. The historical trauma doesn't heal quickly or easily. The promises of the ghost dance didn't come true. The white men didn't disappear. The millions of buffalo didn't return. The dead didn't come back to life. The world that Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse knew is gone forever, and everyone understands that. But the Lakota are still here. The buffalo are still here. The relationship between them, damaged but not destroyed, is being carefully rebuilt by people who understand what was lost and are determined that their children and grandchildren will know at least something of the traditional ways. When buffalo were released at Standing Rock Reservation in recent years, when young Lakota men and women stood watching those animals walk across land their ancestors had defended, when grandmothers sang old songs and grandfathers told old stories, that was sacred hoop mending. Slowly, imperfectly, but really. There's a photograph from one of these buffalo releases. An old man, a Lakota elder, watching the buffalo through a fence. His face is weathered, lined with years of hard living. But he's smiling, and there are tears in his eyes. He's old enough that his own grandfather might have known the buffalo times, might have hunted as a young man before the herds disappeared. And now here he is, old himself, seeing buffalo on tribal land again. The expression on his face is complex. Joy and grief, hope and loss, all mixed together. That's the story right there, in one face, in one moment. The Lakota journey from forest people to plains lords took about 70 years. The destruction of the buffalo culture took about 25 years. As it is, has taken over a century, and it's still ongoing. History moves in strange rhythms. What's destroyed quickly takes generations to rebuild, and even then, it's never quite the same. You can't step in the same river twice. You can't bring back the world of 1840, when 20 million buffalo thundered across the prairie and 40,000 Lakota lived in balance with them. But you can honor that world. You can remember it. You can teach the children about it. You can bring back what pieces you can, preserve what knowledge remains, and build something new that still carries the essential spirit of the old ways. That's what's happening now. That's the work that continues. The sacred hoop is still broken, but people are working to mend it, one buffalo at a time, one ceremony at a time, one child learning the old songs at a time. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not the tragedy, though that's real and important to understand, but the resilience, the refusal to disappear, the determination to keep the culture alive despite everything. The Lakota survived what was designed to destroy them. The buffalo survived extinction. And now, together, they're writing a new chapter that honors the past while facing the reality of the present. It's not the ending anyone would have chosen, but it's not the ending the United States government intended either. The buffalo were supposed to vanish completely. The Lakota were supposed to assimilate and forget. Instead, there are buffalo on Pine Ridge again. There are children learning Lakota. There are ceremonies continuing unbroken since the time of White Buffalo Calf Woman. There are people who refuse to let the story end in that mass grave at Wounded Knee. The thunder of millions of hooves probably won't return to the Great Plains, but the thunder of hundreds, of thousands. That's possible. That's happening. And in the eyes of a Lakota child seeing buffalo for the first time, learning that these were the animals that fed and clothed and housed her ancestors, that sustained a whole civilization, there's a connection being maintained. A thread that goes back through all the darkness, all the way to that moment when forest people first crested the hills and saw the prairie covered with life. The story isn't over. It changed, drastically and tragically, but it didn't end. And as long as there are Lakota people keeping the language and the ceremonies alive, as long as there are buffalo walking on tribal lands, as long as someone remembers what was and teaches what can be, then the sacred hoop keeps mending. Slowly, painfully, but stubbornly, persistently. Hopefully, that's where we are now. That's the story we're still living. And maybe, in another century or two, someone will tell this whole story differently. Maybe they'll talk about the dark time, the destruction, and the near extinction as the low point in a much longer story of survival and renewal. Maybe the buffalo will number in the millions again, and the Lakota will have found a way to keep their culture strong even in the modern world. Or maybe not. Maybe this is as good as it gets, this partial recovery, this preservation of remnants and memories. Either way, it's better than the alternative. It's better than the silence and the bones. It's something worth fighting for, worth remembering, worth passing on to the next generation. The Lakota and the buffalo, still here, still together, still writing their story. And that, after everything, is a kind of miracle.